Welcome to the Animal Training Fundamentals Podcast, where we have fun with practical application and we get mental with the science of behavior. Put them both together and you get results, solutions for your behavior problems, and the tools you need to achieve your training goals. I'm your host, Barbara Heidenreich. Let's talk training. Well, hello, animal training enthusiasts. It's good to have you here. We are back with another Animal Training Fundamentals podcast with Barbara Heidenreich. And this time we're going to talk about growing pains. Oh, yes. It's painful to learn sometimes. So, yes, what inspired this particular episode? Well, I'm actually really excited to learn that there's been some discussion, especially about the podcast I did on 7 myths about negative reinforcement. So I guess people have been talking about counter conditioning and systematic desensitization and how is that different from negative reinforcement. And that's awesome. I'm really excited that people are having those conversations, but it's also getting a little bit controversial. And I understand because, as I mentioned in that podcast, I was in that same place. I wasn't really receptive to negative reinforcement in the way that I've been discussing it in my programs and in the podcast there. But I was really inspired by a comment that I heard from Sean Will and Masa Nishimuta from Constructional Approach to Animal Welfare and Training. They're at cout.com. Yeah, so the statement they made that I thought that was really significant is that we have to have empathy for people who are resistant at the moment, because what we need to remember is that not everybody has had contact with the same stimuli that people who may be on board with shaping with negative reinforcement in the way that I described in that podcast have had already. So they just don't have the same information is basically what that is saying. And it got me thinking a lot about some of the situations that might be occurring for those folks. And we talk about this in animal training when we talk about our animal learners, but this is an important thing to think about our human learners as well. So one of the things I wanted to talk about was competing contingencies. A lot of times I will talk about negative reinforcement competing with positive reinforcement. And we talk about how we have to address the negative reinforcement contingency in order for positive reinforcement to be effective. We talked about that in the podcast about the 7 myths about negative reinforcement. And when I think about that in terms of growing pains for animal trainers, we might think of it in terms of how, in order for a person who we want to have success with applying this negative reinforcement procedure and see the good outcomes, get that positive reinforcement that they might get from having a good result from a procedure, is they have some skill sets that they would have to learn first, like how to apply this procedure and maybe understand the principles behind it. So there's some learning that needs to happen for them first in order for them to get desired results. So that could be some competing contingencies right there. So that means there's a lot of work that needs to be done first in order for them to have success. But that can be a daunting prospect, right? Sometimes having to change and learn new things can be overwhelming. So our job as people who maybe are excited about something and are eager to get everybody on the same page with us might be, how do we help set those folks up for success? How can we make it easy for them to access the information that you may have been studying for years? Like in my case, I've had about 8 to 10 years of exposure to this information now, whereas somebody may have only listened to that one podcast, and that's certainly not going to be enough exposure for them to suddenly be like, yeah, I'm on board. All right, I'm ready to go. So one of the things I think about is repeated exposure to this information was really, really helpful for me. And I think about the very, 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 very first time I saw it applied. I was like, no way, this is not for me. And when I think about the folks that were sharing it with me, it was early in the process for them. They were still refining their procedure. So I think even the procedure that they showed me, this was about a procedure where there were two dogs, and one dog was uncomfortable with other dogs. So some people might call that a reactive dog, and the other dog was comfortable with other dogs. So they were basically bringing the comfortable dog closer to the reactive dog and removing the comfortable, relaxed dog away from the other dog. But when I watched it, I kind of felt like it was a little too much. Like, I felt like the other dog was being brought too close. And so everything in me was saying, no, I don't like this. And I think the folks that were applying that procedure later on went on to refine that more. And I've seen the same thing with my own practices. So you may recall in the podcast episode on the 7 myths, I said that I've refined how I've applied it. So in the beginning, when I was first applying it and trying it on my own, I think I did some things that I now do differently now that I've had more practice at it. And I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind, that the first time I saw it, I was like, nope, not for me. So it took me quite a long time before I went, okay, well, maybe I am open to it. And again, I had that conversation with Jesus Rosales Ruiz where I had to think about it some more. Now I had to think about the science, not just what I observed. I had to think about it a little bit more. And then again, what's happened over the years is hearing more lectures, reading more material, seeing more application of it. And this has been happening over and over and over again. And now, again, as somebody who's talking about it and having applied it, I'm getting more proficient myself. And so it's changed a lot for me by having that repeated exposure. I think another thing that I've seen evolve for me is that procedure that I saw that was being applied for aggression, that was called constructional aggression treatment. And so that terminology was really easy to grab onto, and a lot of people know it by the acronym CAT. And so CAT was the word, right? That was the buzzword. And I was sort of applying that to everything, and I think a lot of people were. And so everything was being called CAT. But it really became a little confusing for me, because then there was also this word constructional approach, but then there were also fear responses, which isn't really aggression. And so there wasn't really a word for what does that procedure, the procedure looks very similar. It looks the same almost, but it's not aggression. So what do we call it when it's being applied to aggression? And so that was sort of confusing. And so another different acronym came up, F, the letter F as in Frank, and then 2, the number 2, and then F, fear to friendly, was being used, which was sort of the application to when it was an animal showing a fear response. And then something new that's come out recently was constructional exposure therapy. And so there were all these different terms being thrown around. And I was having confusion with all that. Everything was sort of being jumbled together. But again, the more that I was reading and the more that I was listening to other people, I started to be able to discriminate all these different things. And so I started to learn that constructional approach is a program that involves these, I don't want to say steps, but these different elements, and that a constructional aggression treatment is a procedure that we use when we are seeing an aggressive response, and that it's a similar procedure, but some different behaviors that we might be responding to when we see a fear response, when we see a fear response. So there's more discrimination that was happening for me, again, as I had more repeated exposure to this material through different mentors, through different material, through other practitioners who are applying this information. So one of the things I really highly recommend for people who are trying to wrap their brains around this material is repeated exposure. Keep letting yourselves yourself have the opportunity to learn from people who are applying this information. And one of the things that I think I'm not sure if I mentioned it in another podcast, but there's a really good book, Nonlinear Contingency Analysis by Joe Lang and Paula Dronis and Trent and Awab. But again, I'll put a link to that in the episode notes there, so that you can get some more information about the constructional approach. There are different procedures that may be involved in the constructional approach, but that'll give you a good starting place, at least, to start getting some more information about some of these different things that are being thrown around there that I know can get all jumbled together, because I am guilty of putting them all together and having a hard time parsing them out. But again, the main point on this is repeated exposure. It's not just one and done and you're going to have this all mastered. But get yourselves out there and give yourself a little grace and a little time to get used to these different ideas and procedures and programs that we're talking about here. I think this also applies to when you hear these discussions about systematic desensitization and counter conditioning. I thought I completely understood these concepts, and I thought I had them down for years. And I will say, even in this moment, as I sit here in this chair recording this podcast, I still am looking at different definitions of these concepts. I don't think it's completely clear and straightforward. And so I'm continually looking for additional information on these concepts. And I think what gets even more confusing for people is what it actually looks like in application. And I think, as I pointed out in the last podcast on the 7 myths, what Jesus described to me in terms of what animal trainers are doing and what we are calling systematic desensitization and counter conditioning, really two different things. And so I think that is really worth exploring more if you haven't already. I would definitely give yourself some time to really dive into those topics. And I continue to dive into those topics to this day, because it is really fascinating. And I think that's one of the cool things about our field is it isn't so, perfectly straightforward and black and white and, completely understood by all of us at this point. And I love that. I actually love that. I find it very exciting that we still have some things to figure out here. Tying in with that is a little bit of this idea of confirmation bias. I think we still have a tendency to, hang on to what we learned in the past and stick with it. I certainly have been guilty of that, but I will say that in recent years, I do kind of enjoy the idea of letting go of that confirmation bias, because again, what has happened is the doors have been open to some new information that I probably wouldn't have been receptive to in the past. And it's really been cool because it's led to some really exciting things that have changed the way that I train animals. And of course, you still need to keep those critical thinking skills going. Obviously, we just don't open the door and let everything come in and, without any judgment going on there. But I will say, there's been some situations where I definitely had my head turned around, and I think about, like, certainly in the past where I was watching animal training where people were doing things that I was like, whoa, that's different from what I had been doing in my past, and it caused me to ask questions. So, for example, getting to hang out with Chris Shank at Cockatoo Downs many years ago and seeing her cockatoos flying for, hours at a time and still coming back and hanging out with her and, eating things off of the trees and still being happy to, if she called him down for a training session to participate and, following her around as she did her daily chores around the property and returning to their aviaries in the evening. That was a really eye-opening experience for somebody who had come from a more regimented situation where birds came out, flew for a few seconds, and then went back in, and we're in their aviaries for the rest of the day, which was a very different dynamic, which was the kind of situation that was happening in the bird show world at the time. And then that caused me to ask questions about what was being done differently in that kind of world where birds could fly all day like that. And it caused me to reach out to other trainers to find out, well, who else is doing that kind of flying? And it turns out there was a lot more than I thought that were flying birds this way. And that led to people like Hillary Hankey at avianbehavior.org who flies birds like that. It also led to finding people who fly birds of prey like that, like Rasmus Nielsen, who can do that as well. So it opened the door to learning about what's possible. And again, when you find evidence that this can be done, then you start to say, okay, well, now we know it can be done. So what's going on here? What are the strategies? What are the training techniques? What are the procedures that make this possible? And then it opens the door to so many more cool things that can be applied in so many different ways. So I think that's some of the things that I really encourage people to consider, is instead of just saying, well, I've always done it this way, so that must be the only way. When you see somebody else doing something that's really cool, start asking questions and saying, well, how is that possible? And then you can put on those critical thinking skills and say, are you okay with the procedures that they're using? And in the case of the folks that I mentioned, I'm 100% on board with the procedures they're using. They're really amazing and really all about animal welfare. And I would say it was the same for me with this negative reinforcement procedure. Even though it took some time for me to get to the place where I was open to trying it and then seeing results that I went, oh, okay, this is working for me. And then as I continued to apply it and refine it and refine it and refine it and refine it and apply it to so many different species, and then as I continued to learn more, especially from people like Joe Lang, as I was saying in the nonlinear contingency analysis book there, I started to really understand the science more and understood what I was actually doing there in terms of addressing negative reinforcement contingency so that positive reinforcement could be effective. So for me, it was a big turning point. And again, I don't think I could have gotten there if I stuck with well, this is the way I've always done it, so this is the only way there is. I really had to let myself have permission to be open to something different, something new, something that I wouldn't have considered in the past, and also give myself permission to have been wrong, which is a hard thing for us to do, but it's okay to say, you know what, the information I had in the past was incorrect. And I think that's is also a nice way to give yourself a break. It's, you only know what you've been exposed to in terms of information, right? And so, wherever that information came from in the past, it's just what was presented to you in the past. And so it's not your fault that you only have that information. And so if you have an opportunity to access different information that is potentially going to improve your animal training and improve the interventions that you can provide clients if you're a consultant, then awesome. You're just moving on to the next tier of your animal training, so to speak. So I think it's a nice, helpful way to look at it, as opposed to something, that is perhaps looking down upon what you were doing in the past. It's just a next stage or a next step in your training based on what was available to you at that time. So again, kind of tying back to what Sean and Masa were talking about, it's just what stimuli you have been exposed to up until that point. And now you have a new set of stimuli that you have exposure to. And now this is going to shape what is happening in your world as far as your animal training is concerned. We're going to take a little break to give you your first secret word, and the secret word is competing contingencies. Secret words are important to remember and submit to show you have listened to this podcast for your professional development. All right, back to the program. We've talked about a few topics: negative reinforcement, some nonlinear contingency analysis, about free-flying birds for a long period of time. But, that's just the beginning. I love the idea of questioning what I think I know, because there are so many exciting topics in the world of animal training right now that keep emerging, and I love it. Now, it's not that these topics were necessarily new, so to speak. I think they've been around for a while, but I would describe them as emerging. And I really feel like when we talk about Israel Golddiamond and Joe Layng, they're the ones who really were talking about these things back in the 60s and the 70s, but this information seems to be kind of rising to the surface right now. And what we are so lucky to have is that, people like Joe Layng and Paula Naranis and Jesus Rosales Ruiz, they're here now, and they're sharing this information with us now, which is amazing. And what we get to do is we get to try and see how this fits in our world of animal training. How does it apply to exotic animals? How does it apply to our companion animals? And how lucky are we? So right now, some topics that are still really cool and exciting for us to be exploring so much more are things like true choice and what does that mean? What does that actually look like? And, everybody keeps talking about control in the animal world. Well, what does that really mean? I don't know. People just say the word, but they don't really, quote, define it, so to speak. And so that's still coming, I think, in a bit more detail. We're going to explore that more down the road, I think. And then emotions, of course. And there's some really, really, really great stuff that is going on in that community. Joe Layng has a really great article about emotions as contingency descriptors that I highly recommend if you haven't read that. And then we had Anna Linehan do a GOATS presentations for us on emotions. And there's some more good stuff coming on the horizon that we'll be talking about later. But these are some topics that, man, we're just getting started is the way I think about it. And I have a long list of topics that I'm still desperate to explore and how to apply those into the animal training world. And, the ones I've just mentioned here, I know those are coming. Those are already high on my list. And we have explored them a little bit. I should also mention, we talked about Sean and Masa doing the one on degrees of freedom, which has to do with true choice as well. Oh, and assent is another one too. So, these are topics that, they're already in the animal training world a little bit, but there's still much, much more to be discussed about those topics. And but there's others as well that I have on my back burner that I haven't even hardly introduced to our community because we still have much more that we need to get through, and I still need to study those topics more before I'm even comfortable trying to talk about them with our community. So I think it's so cool. There is so much more to go in terms of where we are going to be progressing, what more learning there is to come in our animal training community. We are far from done, folks. And I think that is awesome. And that's why it is good for us to be questioning what we think we know. We're not done yet. And I love that. And the way that I think about that is, yes, there is a little bit of a negative reinforcement contingency there for me because I'm not proficient. I'm not fluent in these topics that I said are on the back burner for me. I've got some work to do, right? I've got some skill building to do to be able to understand these topics. But I also know there's some positive reinforcement waiting for me on the other end. If I can get good at these skills, if I can get good at understanding these topics and these skill sets and how to apply them, I think about, oh my gosh, how great is it going to be for animal welfare? How great is it going to be for animal trainers to learn how to do these things and how to apply these things? So yes, there's competing contingencies right there for me right now, but it's okay. I'm at ease with it. I know eventually I'll be able to take care of that negative reinforcement contingency and access the positive reinforcement that's waiting for me at the end there. So how am I going to get there? Well, so one of the things that I really recommend is finding good mentors who expand your horizons and supportive peer groups. And I've mentioned a few names already of people that I think are great resources for information. Now, you may not be able to have direct access to them as mentors who can, you can send an email to or call up or things like that. But certainly they've produced some great, wonderful resources in terms of journal articles, books. Some people have websites that you can access where they have things that you can either sign up for them or things that are freely available. Some of them host events and conferences. So, and I'll put all those resources on the episode webpage so that you can access that information. So there's educational resources out there to continue your growth on this, so you can keep learning from these people that are putting out information that is supporting this growth and this change. And what I find is, especially when I'm talking with these folks or hanging out where there is a supportive peer group that's interested in having discussions about these things, is that a lot of times people will mention a book or an article that they read, or they'll mention somebody else who's doing some really great work, and maybe they've published something, and it'll take me down another path of something else that I want to read. And then in that article, maybe somebody will mention a topic and it'll be related. And this is where I was saying I find all these other topics that I'm like, oh, you know what? At some point I need to study that or I need to get proficient in that topic. And you'll find that they're all very much related. And that's how I build this repertoire of things that I find these are important things, important tools, because they tend to be repeated. You'll find people saying the same information over and over again, and these words start to become more familiar to you. Like I was saying, some of these words for people may feel like, oh, I'm not comfortable with that vocabulary yet. Like I was saying in the beginning, I was struggling with the discrimination between these different words, but you start hearing them over and over again. They start becoming more familiar. You start to get the understanding of what word means what. And same with all these other things that keep appearing over and over again. You start going, oh, you know what? I don't really understand that. I need to learn about that. And clearly it's important because people keep referring to it as they're using that tool or they're using that skill set to help them accomplish these particular goals. So maybe I need to learn how to do that. It could help me here. And so you start seeing how all these things are related. But that, again, comes from hanging out in these peer groups, learning from these particular mentors who are all sort of drawing upon these skill sets to help progress things forward. And I've found this to be incredibly helpful. And again, this kind of, to me, it ties into some of the things we learned from Robert Epstein about creativity, that you just need to expose yourself to these stimuli and to more stimuli. Don't stay in your own little safe circle. You want to expand your horizons, and that's going to help you start to have some generativity, get some creativity going on there and move beyond what's safe and familiar all the time. So important stuff to consider there. Time for your second secret word, and the secret word is safe environment. All right, let's get back to the program. And tying in with that, I know it can seem overwhelming to ingest information. And I'm just like the rest of everybody else here. I am super busy. I've got plenty to do. I am somebody who runs my own business, so I don't really have days off. Every day could be a work day if I wanted it to be, and actually pretty much every day is. So how do I find time to ingest all this great content that's out there? I am one of those folks that I try to listen to content because I find it a little bit easier than just sitting down and reading something. Whereas, somebody else may enjoy reading it directly, off their computer. But, I get tired of staring at a computer screen all the time. So I actually listen to a lot of stuff. So I take advantage of, I'm on a PC, so I use the Microsoft Edge reader. And if it's a PDF, it'll read it to me. So I just put it on on, read aloud, and it'll read it aloud to me. You can pick a lovely voice with an accent if you want. And there's many textbooks that you can get in as a digital textbook. And so I will have textbooks read to me. And I, like other folks, I listen to podcasts, but I try to be a critical thinker on the podcasts that I select. Same with whether it's an education program or a live stream or videos on YouTube. There's a lot of stuff out there that could just fill my time with, fluff, but I save that for when I need a little break. But the stuff that I want to be educational, I try to be careful about what I select, and I listen to it. And I tend to listen to it when maybe I'm doing a meaningless task, that doesn't require my full attention. If I'm preparing animal diets or cleaning the house or, taking a shower or whatever, and I can listen to that content. And that helps me, say, for example, if I'm preparing a podcast or a live stream, I can listen to that content and consume that. And then if I want to go back to it and read it again, with a little bit more focus, or do keyword searches and look for specific content that I really want to zone in on, I can do that later. But at least I get it in at one point. And again, I'll listen to it over and over again, repeated exposure, like I said, so there are many books that I have listened to several times over, just so that I really get that material ingested. So that is how I try to make it a little bit easier on myself in this day and age where we've got so much going on. And, some people, are commuters. And so you might think about, are those things that you could listen to on a commute as opposed to, always just going for something that's a little bit lighter, but again, it's your preference, no pressure, but those are tips and tricks that I use to help myself have opportunities to really get more familiar with the topics that I'm trying to learn more about. And finally, I wanted to mention one of the things I think is most important to help overcome a growing pain, as we say, is to get out there and try the procedure or whatever you're trying to learn, if it's a practical application skill, yourself in a safe environment. Sort of, pick a no judgment zone where you're free to make mistakes. And as I mentioned in the podcast about 7 myths, the biggest thing for me was when I first tried it, I really did it in a place where I wasn't worried if I didn't do it quite right. Nothing bad was going to happen to me. Nothing bad was going to happen to animals. Everything was pretty safe there. And so I was able to apply it and get success really fast. And I wasn't worried if it wasn't the exact perfect application of the procedure. And over the years, I've been able to refine it since then. Oh, another perfect example of it is I was working on a nail trimming procedure with my own parrot, who had started to show like this response to nail clippers, which was weird because I'd never done anything bad to his nails. But he was like, "I don't want you touching me with those nail clippers." And so my skill set in terms of my timing to remove the nail clippers when he was, and I did this protected contact, by the way, I should mention. I was trying to time removing my hand with the nail clippers, prior to him moving his foot away. I wanted him to keep his foot positioned on the bars just right. And I was having a hard time getting my timing right. And I think I was so used to removing my hand when I saw a fear response, as opposed to removing my hand when his foot stayed calm and relaxed, because I had so much reinforcement history of the animal's afraid, move your hand away. And really, your goal is to remove your hand before the animal shows a fear response. So that took practice. And it was also trying to do it with my left hand as opposed to my right hand. So it was tough for me to practice. And so again, practicing it in my own home with my own bird was a very safe place for me to do that. And again, I highly encourage you to find, if you want to work on these negative reinforcement procedures that we've been talking about, I highly recommend you try to find that kind of circumstance. And if you're this is your first time listening to a podcast and you have no idea what I'm talking about, go back and listen to the 7 Myths About Negative Reinforcement podcast. And if you want to learn more about that procedure, more details about how to apply it, I do have a course that goes through the steps in a lot of detail, and I'll provide a link to that in our show episode notes so you can find out more about that. But there you go. That is our episode about growing pains and how to overcome them. Think of them as negative reinforcement contingencies competing with positive reinforcement. How do we overcome those barriers? How do we make it easy for us to access positive reinforcement? Well, we got to take away those barriers. We got to make it a little bit easier for us to have those skill sets, get those skill sets, access those skill sets so that we can apply these procedures easily and get the results that we want. So I hope that was helpful. Hope it was informational, and I hope you can get past your growing pains so you can access all the wonderful reinforcers that you seek to acquire. All right, everybody, that is it. Thank you for joining me on this week's episode, and I look forward to seeing you next time. If you liked what you heard today, visit animaltrainingfundamentals.com for more quality content on animal training. You'll find courses, community, and extensive video examples from my consulting work around the world. We'd love to have you join our force-free family.